Hello, my name is Gordy Hogue, and this is Community Connect. Each of us has stories that help us to understand and to explain our world. I have been very fortunate to have met many interesting people who have had a positive, profound impact on our community and far beyond. People who have had incredible life experiences and fascinating stories that help us to better understand our world. And they help us to connect with each other. And Community Connections is about those people and about their stories. And I'm sure that you will enjoy meeting these amazing, amazing people as much as I have. Thank you. Enjoy. Welcome to Community Connections. My name is Gordy Hogue, and today's guest is a compassionate visionary who has led by example. He's led in our community, he's led in our province, and he's had an impact nationally. He's led with progressive, principled beliefs, led in programs for the community living sector, in housing, and particularly for pushing an inclusive, engaged community development. Welcome, Doug Tennant. Welcome to Community Connections. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thanks, Gordon, and I really appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
So can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you ended up in this community and the things that you can think of along the way that may have influenced where you are today?
Absolutely, and I was just thinking when you're asking that question I was a teacher for some time, and one of the books that the kids enjoyed reading was Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. And when I look back at my life and to where I am today, I really feel like I've had a series of fortunate events to get me to where I am. And so I think luck and serendipity has been a big part in my life. And I was born in 1967 in Vancouver. Not too many people that I know can say that they are BC born and bred. And grew up in Vancouver. My father was a professor at UBC, focusing in on municipal affairs as well as Indigenous affairs. And my mother was a school teacher, and then later on became a professor and went to Japan actually to work there. And when I was young, one of the memorable and empowering events was when I was only 3, and my father went on sabbatical to Penang, Malaysia, and we stayed for 2 years. And I think that really opened up my eyes and my mindset to different cultures and to just the idea that differences aren't necessarily bad, and in fact they can be really good if you're open to them. And I do recall when I came back from there, I think in 1972, it was so cold and gray in Vancouver compared to Malaysia and Penang. I went to the first French immersion school in Vancouver called L'École Bilingue, and I was there from grade 1 to 3. And then I think I started, my mom was a bit worried I was hanging out with the wrong crowd in grade 3, because I think I was getting into fights and I had a broken collarbone and things like that. So she sent me to York House, and those of you who know York House, it's actually an all-girls school, but it wasn't back then. And back then, from grade 3 to grade 6, or from kindergarten to grade 6, boys were allowed there as well. And so there weren't a lot of boys that were at the school when I was there, maybe 4 or 5 in the whole school. And I do recall from grade 3 to 6, like I quite enjoyed it, because it seemed a really compassionate place to be. And I think being the only boys there, you were outside of, perhaps mean girl games that could have been played. You were just sort of an alien, and so you weren't included in those. And then after that, in grade 7, I went to St. George's, and again, a bit of a culture shock there, where it was all boys. Really enjoyed the athletics there, enjoyed the school, but also at the same time was aware then and more aware now that there certainly were groups of people that I just wasn't made familiar with going to that school. So there were no kids with developmental disabilities, for example, and no girls. So it was a different school, and when I graduated from then and went to UBC, I think it took me a few years to sort of get my act together because I'd been in this sort of sheltered and yet kind of tough school. And so I always say that UBC for me was the 10-year, 4-year degree. It took me 10 years to complete my degree. And part of the reason for that was for most of the time, I was also working full time and also playing rugby, where I played with the rowing club and then with UBC for a year as well.
That sounds like a pretty good start for things. A 10-year program. I think I took a 6-year program for my 4-year degree, so you outdid me clearly. So where did you go from there when you ended up after this 10-year, 4-year program?
Yeah, so sort of midway through that, I actually met the person that really changed my life, and that's my stepdaughter, Krista. She was 3 years old at the time. And she has Down syndrome, and meeting her changed my life because I came to realize that because of how she was labeled, she did not have the same chances or opportunities in life that other people had. And she was a groundbreaker, even at a young age. She was the first child with a developmental disability to attend her elementary school, Cougar Canyon in North Delta. And when she was going to go there, which was in kindergarten, to let the parents and the families and the community know that they were now going to have kids with developmental disabilities in the school, they had a meeting, and there was about 400 people at that meeting. It was the largest meeting that school had with families and community. And in that meeting, I was really exposed to bigotry that was quite shocking, like a doctor standing up and saying, "This will never work. They're meant to be in different schools," and using it as example, a time when my stepdaughter refused to get off a swing. And they couldn't do that, and so it was fortunate that I was at the meeting and was able to sort of counter those points by pointing out that if a group of school teachers and principals can't resolve a 4-year-old or 5-year-old getting off a swing, then we probably have issues that are a little bit more serious than what he's talking about right there. And at the same time, I also, with that, was exposed to the principal of the school, who was a very strong proponent of inclusion. And he said, according to the teachers that were at that school that I heard about later on, he came into the first staff room meeting where this was being discussed, and he'd been brought over from Annieville, another school that was inclusive in Delta. The first things he said was, if you're not going to support inclusion in the school, there's the door, and don't let it hit behind you. And that to me was a powerful thing for him to come into a school where he was new and to make that statement, because it was the right statement to do. And I learned a lot from Krista, as she was one of the very few kids with developmental disabilities who were going to that school, and just how she changed the view of the people around her, both students as well as teachers, who would want to have her in their class the next year, and follow her up almost, because they realized that, a class where she was in there was already just could be a much more kinder and compassionate class as well.
Yeah, you should tell that story. I remember when I was Minister of Children and Families, don't know if you know Lynnrolko, but Lynn is active in the community living sector, and her young daughter went through and graduated in high school, and she was one of the first students in Victoria to be included. And she unfortunately passed away, but they showed a wonderful video at her memorial where each of the kids were walking across the stage getting their certificate and shaking hands with the principal. And she ran across the stage and gave the principal a big hug, and every student in the crowd stood up and threw their hats. It was just right. She changed, because awesome. You're describing, she had just such a profoundly positive influence on that whole school and all the parents and everyone who attended that graduation. It still touches me. Yeah, quite amazing. So then, where did you go from there?
Right. So at that time, after meeting Krista, at the time I was bartending, and going to school. But I did decide at that point that I needed to sort of shift my sort of focus in life. And I actually went to work as a child and youth care counselor, working for Options Community Services. And it's quite interesting now because I go back there and I'll do work with them, you know, in restorative practices and things like that. And always nice to say that I worked there for probably 10 years. And that was supporting youth and children who have developmental disabilities or autism. And again, really loved that work and probably would have sort of stayed in that field at that time longer, except for you know, it's difficult to support a family at $16 an hour. And by then, Aaron and Nick, my daughter and son, had also come along. And so I needed to work in a field that where it was going to be more of a career, where I was going to be able to support my family. And so did go back to school at UBC and get my teaching degree. And ended up teaching at a school called Delview in North Delta for 5 years. And then at the end of that, because I was laid off every year, and sort of there was a rather, I guess, ironic thing where I was the union steward at my school, but I would be rehired by my principal at the end of every year and given like a dog's breakfast of courses that I would teach. And then the union would say, well, but you don't have enough seniority, it has to be grieved. And so I would be the person grieving my own rehiring. So I would have to put in a grievance for myself. And after 5 years, I went to the principal and said, listen, like this happens every year. Can you at least guarantee that it's not going to happen next year? He said, no, it is going to happen next year. And I think that following year was like 5.5 years that beginning teachers were asked to, you know, were laid off. And I have a real problem with that because relationships are so important. You establish relationships in your school and then all of a sudden you have to move on. So at that point, the headmaster at St. George's, where I'd gone to school, had been part of opening a school in South Surrey called Southridge. And I'd been invited to apply for positions there, but I turned it down, and largely because philosophically I'm not a huge supporter of sort of that exclusionary school experience, but you know, I was going to get laid off again. So I thought, yeah, I'll give it a try, and went to work at Southridge. And Southridge again kind of opened my eyes, and in the sense that even though it's not fully inclusive and there aren't kids with developmental disabilities who go there, it's a very kind and compassionate school. And I got involved with Semiama House through Southridge, where I had a group of volunteers, and over the years, over 600 students have volunteered at Semiama House, and really started a partnership with Southridge and Semiama House Society that's continued at this time and has had a really deep and positive impact on both organizations and the people involved with both organizations. So at Southridge, for example, a lot of the students that came and volunteered with Semiama House have gone on and now are like, you know, business owners and are doing things where they have an inclusive mindset and are very open to including people with disabilities. An example of that would be one of the really great students I had, Laura Cranfield, who is now the, I think, Vice President of Marketing for Lush North America. She called me up about a year ago and said, Doug, you know, we'd love to do a campaign featuring people with developmental disabilities, just as like anybody else. And so through her, we were able to set up some photo shoots for people with developmental disabilities, who were then included without comment of like, oh, here's people with disabilities, just like as part of their marketing campaign and their models. And just seeing, you know, one of the pictures with a person who uses our services received over 100,000 likes. So like just that change. And it's, you know, because of that connection that was made with this student when she was young and, you know, volunteering with Semiama House, it bore fruit, you know, 15 years later when she got the position that she has now. And again, it's about relationships and sort of that thoughtful fostering of relationships for the benefit of not just people with disabilities, but everybody. Because Laura Cranfield's a better person because she had the experience of getting to know some people with developmental disabilities. And so, you know, it's a reciprocal relationship. And that's something that I've tried to bring to Unity. And Unity is the name for the 3 not-for-profit organizations that I'm responsible for: Semiahmoo House Society, Peninsula States Housing Society, and the Semiahmoo Foundation. And that reciprocity means that we have to support people with disabilities to be in positions of power where they can give back. I mean, you can imagine what it would be like if your whole life, your only role was to receive help. I know that I would certainly be punching people on a regular basis if that was all that was happening, was me receiving help. And so we have to set up authentic and support people to be authentically able to give back to the community. And when we consult with people with disabilities, that's the #1 thing they say to us: I want an opportunity to volunteer and to have a job and to give back to my community, because that is part of being a citizen. And when we set up those opportunities, what we see is that it works out really well, and not just for the people with disabilities, for everyone. And 2 examples of that would be, probably the one that I like to talk about the most is Chorus Apartments, which was completed in 2016, a housing project, an inclusive housing project that got started in 2003 when Paul Wheeler, my predecessor, had the foresight to bring together people with disabilities and their families and say, hey, what's important to you? What do you really want? And they came back and said, well, you know what? Housing is probably the #1 most important thing, because it's the foundation of everything else. And if we had a choice, we would like to, you know, live in an apartment and close to family, friends, where there's jobs, transit, all the rest of that. And again, not anything different for a person with developmental disability than anybody else. If you go around South Surrey, what you see is the kind of housing that Chorus is: apartments that are close to transportation, shopping, and all the rest of that. So that was a 14-year project that was completed in 2016. And because it was built as an inclusive model with the idea that 20 of the 71 homes would be for people with developmental disabilities, and we knew who those people were, the tenants with developmental disabilities, we gave them first choices to their apartments. And something kind of interesting happened where there's a really good view from the 4th floor. So all of the tenants with developmental disabilities all wanted to live on the 4th floor, and I had to sort of like put a pause on it and say, you know, much as I would like that sort of, you know, reversal of what usually happens, where the affluent rich people go live in the penthouse, maybe with a separate door, and, you know, the people that are, you know, not as affluent have to live, you know, on the lower floors. I said, this is an inclusive model, and so we have to make sure that people are spread out throughout the building, and people bought into that. But because they were able to get their places first, and in some cases move in first, it put them in a position of power, because they were the people welcoming the rest of the community into the apartment. And the apartment was built because of our need to ensure that people with disabilities had housing, but then because it's inclusive, the whole community benefits. And it was actually the first purpose-built rental apartment in Surrey in about 3 decades. So, you know, when you look at through the lens of like supporting people with developmental disabilities, it's almost always, if not always, going to benefit the entire community. So right now, that apartment's been going for 4 years with really positive reviews and outcomes for everybody who lives there. It's really a beautiful apartment. It's close to shopping. We do a study called the Include Me quality of life study that our funder, Community Living British Columbia, has organizations like ours do to ensure that people are being included in the community. And generally, when you look at the results of people without disabilities are generally higher than the results of people with disabilities, especially around a few key ones. One is your knowledge of rights. People without disabilities generally have, developmental disabilities generally have a higher knowledge about rights. And they also generally have a higher overall quality of life. When we dug down in that study for the 21 tenants with developmental disabilities who are living in Chorus, it was reversed. They had the same amount of knowledge about their rights as the general population, and their overall quality of life was higher. So that demonstrates to me that inclusive living, where a person is supported not in a custodial way, but in a way where their needs and desires are supported, they are going to have a better life. And so that's what we try to do here. And we're right now working on another apartment in South Surrey called Harmony. And it will have 91 homes. And again, the same model as Chorus, where a certain number, 20 to 25, will be for people with disabilities, and the rest just for the general population. And so we want that apartment, like Chorus, to be reflective of the general community.
How is this challenge with COVID influencing the things that you're doing and presenting any new issues or problems for you?
Great question. And that actually, I said there was two examples. So this is sort of my second example then of leadership coming from the people who are most impacted. And so people with developmental disabilities have been impacted greatly by COVID. And you can imagine people who rely on organizations like ours or their families or their home share providers to support them. It's been very difficult during COVID-19 because if you need someone else to be able to get out into the community, it's highly likely you're not going to be able to sort of get out and get fresh air and do the things that other people are doing during this crisis. So where there's been some real leadership shown in that is with the Self Advocates of Semiahmoo, which are a group of community development experts who have disabilities, who have done a lot of wonderful things, including bringing beach wheelchairs to White Rock and Surrey beaches. And so during COVID-19, they have actually taken a lead at sort of sharing information and support to the whole community about, for example, how to wear PPE properly, so that families who are going to visit their loved ones who might be in hospital and who then need to wear PPE to do so know how to do it properly. Sharing sort of some of the things that they've been doing to stay entertained and connected while they're at home. And another group that we've been supporting is the Self Advocate Leadership Network, which is a group of people with developmental disabilities from across British Columbia who are, again, taking the lead during COVID-19 and doing a lot of advocacy work for people with developmental disabilities, including sending out news releases that respond to what the government is doing to combat COVID-19. I think the government's been doing a very good job. And one of the areas where they were quite responsive, it took a little bit of time, but governments generally do take a bit of time, as you would know better than I, there was a policy that was put into place for COVID-19 that made it very difficult for support workers or family members to go into hospital to support someone with a developmental disability, especially in some key areas, two being communication and decision making. So I'm aware that people with developmental disabilities need support to make an informed decision, either like putting things into plain language, or if the person doesn't communicate by speaking, putting it together in a way that they understand what the decision is that they're making. And one of the tragedies during this time was a young lady called Reese Knight, who we supported in a group home, went into hospital. We were not allowed to go in to support her. Her family was not allowed to go in to support her. And she passed away without any of her loved ones there. And that led us, the family of Reese, her brother in particular, myself and this organization, and maybe especially people with developmental disabilities, really advocated strongly to get that policy changed. And, kudos to government. They did change that policy, and BC was the first government to create a policy where essential visitors could go into hospital to support people with disabilities in decision-making and communication needs, not just like the medical needs. And so that was good. And I kind of doubt that would have happened if the Self Advocates had not taken a leadership role and in a polite and yet powerful way said this needs to change. And it was changed because of that.
So I know you're also chair of the Surrey Board of Trade now. And how has the Surrey business community been affected by the pandemic? And are there any creative solutions? And how do you blend your role there with your role with Unity? And how do they complement each other?
Yeah. So, and I, the way I see it is that for a long time, and even now, not-for-profits and community services, and maybe especially community living, have had a mantra of being inclusive, and yet sometimes are not as inclusive themselves. And so I go to meetings where everybody is, you're preaching to the choir. Everybody, yes, inclusivity is great. You look around the room, it's all service providers like myself. So you're not going to elicit change unless you can actually bring your message to everybody in the community. And especially right now, the business community. My experience with, business owners, with developers, et cetera, is that they're all very open and like they're good people. They want to be inclusive. They might not know how to. And if not-for-profits are sitting in one corner with this idea, but never actually interacting with businesses, it's more unlikely to happen. So it was really important for me that I get involved with the business community and to give back. So to volunteer my time, so that, again, it's a reciprocal relationship where if I'm expecting businesses to hire people with disabilities, businesses to, reach out and be inclusive, then I have to demonstrate that myself. I can't be asking but then not doing anything to support business. So that's why I got involved with the Surrey Board of Trade. The other part of it is the Surrey Board of Trade is a very progressive board of trade where they understand the connection between social services and business. A couple of really key policies that the Board of Trade has supported, and Anita Huberman's been fantastic in doing this, is childcare. The Board of Trade understands that there is a direct connection between affordable and quality childcare and having businesses that prosper, because you need your employees to know that your kids are safe and then they can come to work and be happy and be good employees as well. And the other one is affordable housing. So the Board of Trade very much understands that you can't have employees living in your city being happy and content if they can't afford where they live and they need to work 3 or 4 jobs to make ends meet. We see that already in Vancouver. Surrey is getting very close to that, if it's not there already. And so the more affordable housing, like the housing that we built that we can get going, the better it is going to be for businesses in Surrey, as well as the increased customers that they'll have. People who live in affordable housing, they shop locally. Right? They're not generally buying on Amazon. They might not be, flying to Mexico. I mean, no one's flying to Mexico now, but they might in the typical times. They're not, maybe traveling, 10 miles to a Costco. They're shopping in their community, and so affordable housing has been demonstrated to really build the community and to help small businesses. And so that connection is another one that the Board of Trade has been doing. About COVID-19. I've been very impressed, as has the Board of Trade, with how operationally the Surrey Board of Trade has responded under Anita Huberman's leadership. And so when it struck, the last in-person event, you may have even been there, was where Premier Horgan was doing a speech, and I just remembered I think, were you there? I think you were.
Yes,
And it was like this kind of awkward, strange event where, some people are just like hitting elbows with each other. I think it was like March 13th or something like that. Other people are giving full body hugs. And I'm like, okay, that probably shouldn't be happening right now. And so the day after that, Anita made the really difficult decision of like, we've got to stop our events, because she saw what was coming and knew that in a crisis, you can't wait on a decision. You might make the wrong decision, but you need to make a decision. And so she made that decision at financial loss to the Surrey Board of Trade. But since then has rebounded fantastically in online town halls, online connections to federal, provincial, municipal politicians, and really ensuring that the businesses in Surrey are represented and even some studies that have been done about workforce that the Surrey Board of Trade has led. It's been pretty impressive, and I'm very proud of the way the Surrey Board of Trade has been a leader of the community during COVID-19.
So as a community, if you're to look forward based on the many principles of inclusivity that you've talked about, what would you see as the next steps, and ideally where are we going to be 25 years from now, and what's our community and our world going to look like if those principles are actually lived out?
We need to get to the point where it's not exceptional to talk about these examples. So we need to get to the point where it's just natural that if you build an apartment, there's going to be some people with developmental disabilities that are going to be living there, and they're great tenants. We need to get to the point where you walk into a store and an employee has a developmental disability and nothing said about it. It's just part of it. We need to have those examples. So what we're starting to get now is we've got some examples. For many years, parents of kids with developmental disabilities, and then those kids themselves, as they start to try to figure out their lives, have been looking at like, okay, where could I be? Who could I be? And, right now or 10 years ago, it was like, okay, well, you can live in a group home, you can live in shared living, or you're going to be living with your parents until they pass away in terms of where you're going to live. For jobs, well, you might work in a restaurant, you might work, janitorial, cleaning up stuff, but that's really all that's out there for you. We have started to shift that. So now young people can look at Chorus and go, oh, I'm going to be able to move out when I'm 21 or 22 and have a place of my own, and maybe have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner that I can live with at some point, get married. They might look at some of the great employees that we support who are working for the federal government now, doing fantastic work, and say like, oh, I'm going to get a job in the civil services. So like those shifts have to happen, but they don't happen if there's not examples, because then we're just imagining it. And now we're starting to get the point with Unity where we're seeing it. Not only we're seeing it, but we're seeing how positive and beneficial it is to the whole community to have that. So I'm pretty psyched that in 10 years, 20 years, those examples are going to be there, and then young people and their families are going to be demanding that, hey, this is my right. And guess what? I'm going to work hard to get there, but that door needs to be open when I come and knock on it. And it hasn't been in the past, but it is starting to be now. So I'm super optimistic, and I'm optimistic because of the people that I know, including yourself, and the relationships that our organization has with the business community, with other organizations, and just with the people of White Rock and South Surrey, who in my estimation are generous and kind, and just need to know a little bit more about people with developmental disabilities, so they get to know them and they understand that they've got the same hopes and dreams as anybody else.
And there are so many of them at Unity who are role models in our community.
Absolutely.
So much. Yeah. And so it's not just examples, but role models, so we can refer to names and to people and the great contributions they're making to businesses and around our community. Yeah, it's a big difference. Thank you so much, Doug, for taking the time and giving us some wonderful insights into what our future should be. And I hope everybody who looks at this will hear your compassion and your caring and your insights in terms of how we can be an inclusive society. Thank you so very much.
I appreciate it, Gordy.
Thank you for joining us today on Community Connections. Please tune in to our next show as more amazing people share their wonderful stories. If you haven't already, please click on the red subscribe button below, right down there, and view our updates. Feel free to leave any thoughts or comments that you may have. We're always trying to do a better job of connecting this wonderful community. Thanks again for joining, and until next time, keep connecting. Thank you.